Good afternoon. I hope that you're all well. My name is Daisy and I work for Getting On Board. You're very welcome this afternoon. I hope that you're here for the session and the great discussion we're about to have. If we designed charities today, how would we structure them? I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I've just got a few minutes of housekeeping and then I'll hand over to get the conversation started. So the session has just started recording and you'll get access to that recording following this session. We're not using any slides today, so you won't get those. Please could I ask that you stay muted on the call? It just makes sure that everyone can hear who is talking. We've also got our panelists spotlighted, so hopefully they should stay on your screen throughout the call. You can enable closed captions if they're useful to you, but you need to enable those. The request will come through to me and I will obviously say yes. So if you have any trouble with that, just drop me a message in the chat. Please use the chat to ask questions and share your experiences and react to what people are saying. We'd love to hear from you. I imagine this is a topic where people might have different opinions on what's being said. So please could I ask that you keep your comments respectful and useful. And then lastly, we just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Russell Cook, who are supporting the Trustee Learning Programme, of which this session is part of. The session is free for you to attend and Russell Cook support has allowed that to happen. So thank you very much to them for sponsoring. So that's all I've got to say. And I'll hand over to Felicia now, who is chairing our conversation today.
Great. Thank you, Daisy, and hello to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Any of you who know me from LinkedIn or anything like that know that I'm not a neutral chair on today's topic. I talk quite a lot about the issue of the broken charity sector. I've even written stuff for Getting On Board before about it. So don't expect a lack of bias from me today. But I think it's going to be really interesting to hear what our panelists have to say. And I will try to keep my views to a minimum because one of the big points I constantly make is I'm not the right person to be trying to fix the sector. So what we're here to talk about today is really, if we were going to design charities today, how would we do it? Are we faced with a sector that is still designed on kind of pre-Victorian and Victorian ideals of the haves and the have-nots coming in and doing unto people, the have-nots? Are we looking at a world that is really not fit for purpose? We know that 75% of trustees come from the above average median income. And we know that those who are most likely to access charitable services are the least likely to actually serve on boards. So we've also seen in recent years the discussions around things like the hashtag #CharitySoWhite. We have been grappling with a lot of issues around inclusion and particularly around racism in the sector. So my background is I work as a governance consultant, strategic planner, an interim CEO. I've led 8 charities across periods of change and transition and crisis. And I've also served as a CEO, as a trustee. So I've seen it from all sides. And my view is that we're constantly being exposed to examples of abuses of power, of unaccountable trustee behavior, and a general lack of respect for the sector. So what can we do about it and what would we do if we were going to do things differently? I'm going to ask each of the panel to introduce themselves and just say a couple of words on their perspective on this issue. And they're completely allowed to disagree with me, despite not being a neutral chair. But I'm going to start with Anu, if I can. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and just give a few thoughts on what you think on this?
Thank you, Felicia, and Getting On Board for having me today. I'm Anu. I use she and they pronouns. I have about 13, 14, something like that years experience in this sector more broadly in the UK and in India. I have, like probably quite a lot of people here, been quite harmed by the sector, to put it lightly. So what I'm passionate about, I suppose, is going to the very root cause of the issues, because I think we tend to deal with the symptoms because they're easier to deal with. My practice, I'm self-employed. I work with organizations, charities, and philanthropy, broadly speaking. And my practice centers an unapologetic commitment to those who are most harmed by the way things are. And I would probably describe myself as a bridge builder. Like how can we get to what we want from where we are right now, which is the difficulty. The vision is great, but how we get there is can be challenging. How I feel about it, I think people that do have power and privilege, and I don't say this as a broad sweeping statement, I mean anybody that can and has the luxury of hiding or looking away are able to do that, and that is it's just the way that things are set up. community care practices, the alternatives to what charity is, I suppose, exist. We saw that during the lockdowns in 2020. Mutual aid kind of popped up because this isn't our first rodeo. We've survived very many extinctions. We know what that's like. And so that kind of emerged, even as charities didn't have very much space to practice because of the restrictions at the time. So to me, the question isn't really what if we started on a blank slate, because I don't think that's possible. Even if you did start charity from scratch, the conditions that created the vacuum, I suppose, that charity has taken up, they still exist, and we can't look away from that. So my questions are more interrogating, I suppose, why is charity needed? What role does it fulfill? Why does it play that role? How does it play that role? And then we can really have a conversation about what is needed. Stop there.
Thanks, Anu. Alex, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please, and to share your initial thoughts?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Blackmeyer. Thank you for joining us today. Hopefully it's going to be a really interesting discussion. So, but I appreciate your time sort of coming and hearing thoughts as well. And I really hope you sort of participate, ask questions, all of that type of jazz. I've sort of worked in a charity sector since I was about 12 years old, sort of started volunteering. I've probably lived, breathed, volunteering community sector. So I became a consultant, about sort of 5 years ago, but I've sort of worked at a council for voluntary services, helping charities and local sort of voluntary sector organisations for the last 12 years or so. I know I don't look old enough, but yes, I have been. I've set up charities, I've started social enterprises, partnerships, all of that type of jazz. Helping them develop is my day-to-day role. And more focused towards sort of inequality work, particularly around health inequalities within our systems. I found this question really interesting, and I thought my immediate thing was almost like, are they an outdated system? Of course they're an outdated system. But actually, when I thought about it, I actually thought, no, they're not an outdated system. I think they're really facing being an outdated system. And they are an ineffective model in a lot of ways, but I don't quite think they are outdated at the moment, or yet, I should say. I think the sector is at a critical juncture, though, and I just think we need to reflect quite fast and really put in some really transformational change for it to be less outdated. So yeah, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, so thank you.
Great, thanks, Alex. Ellie, can I ask you to introduce yourself as well?
Hi everyone, I'm Ellie. I echo what's been said before about thank you for people taking up their time to come and join us today. So a bit about me, I've been volunteering also since I was in my early teens, so over 15 years, and I've been a trustee for the last 5 years. I also did some work with the Young Trustee movement as the Greater London ambassador, and so looking at how do we bring young people and other demographics into charity leadership spaces. I think one of the things, not wanting to repeat what other people have said, is about when we think about change, we need to be really clear about what we want to retain and what we want to change, and for what purpose. We need that change to be really purposeful, and that it's really important that we think that the purpose of charity is to benefit society. Charity, we have these really clear definitions of purpose when it comes to charitable purpose, and so we should expect evolution to happen as society evolves. And so I think at the moment what we need to make sure is we're addressing that disconnect, rather than taking a sort of burn it down approach. Yes, it's outdated, and looking at what the purposeful changes are, because there are sectors of the charity sector which are doing really well, and there are other parts that aren't. I guess in my other life, I'm a civil servant, and so sort of one of the things that really interests me about the charity sector is the way it's segmented in its terms of purposefulness, in terms of trying to deal with these really systemic challenges, but often with a niche angle. And so sort of seeing that.
Great, thanks. And last but not least, Andrew, could you introduce yourself? Oh, you're muted still. Yeah.
Myself, yes, thank you. I'm Andrew. I'm a partner at Russell Cook, working in the charity team, doing governance and sort of legal stuff for charities. Ellie, thank you for that, because you led perfectly into what my thought was. I think that, I mean, there's lots of mixed up things from a legal perspective. Charity is more a sort of tax status. A charity gets the benefit of tax status, but underlying structures are trusts, royal charters, companies, CIOs, all sorts of different legal entities. That is one level of complexity that we can talk about if we're talking about structure. But I also think it's what charities are being used for. If you think back into the Victorian ages, it was very much, there is a poor person, we'll give them food, we'll give them shelter, we'll give them money. Nowadays, you've got very sophisticated payment by results contracts being issued by government departments to a charity to alleviate a need of society, which, big philosophical question, is that the government's job or is that charity's job? What they've tried to do is outsource it to charities with strict conditions attached to what they can and can't do. And I think that's one of the things that adds so much complexity to the sector, that it's square peg round hole in many situations. I could go on, but we'll leave the rest for some debate.
Yeah. So one of the things that obviously has come up is alternatives to what we have at the moment. So, when we talk about the charity structure, I guess I'm thinking in terms of registered charities, those who have to report to the Charity Commission, those who are led by voluntary trustees. So when we talk about the structure, that's the context I'm thinking of it in. So, Anna, you mentioned mutual aid things that came up during COVID. I'd be really interested to hear a bit more about those. It's not an area I'm hugely familiar with. I don't know if others are, but could you give us a bit more information? And if you have other thoughts on, I guess, alternatives to what we've currently got, I'd be really interested to hear.
Sure. So I would say mutual aid is a community care practice that is probably, it's not necessarily just a racialized communities thing. It has existed since the beginning of time. Inherently as people, these are things that come quite naturally to us. However, I suppose one of the differences that I'll share is I grew up in India. I grew up to people that do grassroots kind of activism and what would be classed as a professionalized like charity model here, but is very, very much part of our like daily thing. When I moved here in 2010, I had to learn very quickly that it's very professionalized. Like I had to put on paper, I'm a volunteer, and that meant a particular thing. And it meant that that was the only thing that got me my first job. Like they didn't care about my experience from before. So I then kind of went, okay, this legitimizes somehow, it becomes this entity of, and so that brings its own power into the situation. Whereas if you know that your neighbor's poorly, if, I don't know, a disaster has happened, it comes quite naturally to people to give. That's kind of the underlying thing, I suppose, with mutual aid. So those networks of checking in with people, of knowing when somebody isn't okay, all of those things are kind of lost to mainstream culture, I would say, but they very, very much exist. So although I don't see my neighbors every day, I know when they're not, when I haven't seen them in a few weeks, I know something's up and I know to check in. And I know to drop food around. So kind of using those networks and kind of mapping what is it that people at the sharpest end of injustice are feeling benefits all of us. As Andrew said, there's so very many different types of charities. There's the ones that look after buildings, right? That's their whole purpose. I don't relate to that. I don't really care. I mean, it's nice to have a membership to the National Trust, and it's been very, very handy during the summer holidays. But when I think of charity, I don't think about infrastructure like that. I think about how we support each other as people. So I guess when you're asking the question of how do we fix charities, I'm kind of seeing it as a question that is, how do we fix a profession? A thing that has come to, like a structure that we've created that has come to being, when actually what's underneath it all is how we show care. and I'm not sure there's any need to fix that. It's more how it's regulated, what is seen as important and not what you have to prioritize when money is involved, which is a lot of the issue is concentrated around how much money you receive. Are you funded? Are you underfunded? Who do you need to cut out because you need to make good on contractual commitments? Those are the things that bring in all of the layers of complexity that you have to deal with. But when you strip it all back down, those things are not lost to us.
Thanks. It's interesting, is I know a lot of people when I've had these conversations talk about the fact that we need to just, I can't remember who said it, but something like burn the house down and start over. And of course, that seems like a really difficult thing to do in reality. So Ellie, you were just talking before about how, it might be, what do we want to keep and what do we want to change? Is it possible to tweak? Are there things that you would see that you would, see as priorities to change and to tweak, retaining some of what we have already from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we don't devalue the value of volunteering, right? Like people both get value from that and learn a lot. I think we need to be really careful to be clear that there's not that in some volunteering situations there is not an innate imbalance. Like I have learned huge amounts from volunteering and have gained huge amounts from that, and I wouldn't want that to be valued. But with that recognition, there is a privilege in my ability to participate, and that's what needs tweaking. So like I guess there is that thing about who is able to volunteer and who is like if we think about time as a commodity, like we are living in a world where particularly increasingly young people do not have secure, consistent employment, and therefore the expectation that they give up time is a privilege. And if we recognise, coming back to what I said as well, that we recognise that this is a benefit to society and the societal benefit of that, what is the remuneration and the recognition that we are giving in exchange for that, and that enables more people to participate. And I also think there is something about what is the charity sector doing with young people, and by young people I'm talking under 18s, that when we engage quite regularly with lots of charities engage regularly with schools, for example, are they embedding, have you ever thought about becoming a charity leader? These are skills that might be really useful, and actually like upskill people. And we have access as a sector to those spaces. And are we investing really early that goes, as a bit like Anu said, that these are professions, like ultimately that is the culture we live in. So to what extent do we need to tweak, and what extent can we use the spaces that the sector has access to drive some really useful and beneficial change?
Thanks. I think it's an interesting thing around volunteering, because of course we're called the voluntary sector, which for all of those of us who are paid in the voluntary sector, it can often be a bit confusing. And I mean, I've been told many times, why don't you work for free? And point to house and children and feeding them and that kind of thing. But I guess there's a question, and I'm going to just throw this open to whoever wants to answer it. Volunteering is one thing. Should we have a voluntary trustee board who aren't necessarily professionalized when we have a professionalized sector? Is that something that's a problem that needs to change?
I don't mind coming into that. Paying trustees, volunteers, are so difficult, because there's something quite nice and traditional in nostalgia sometimes. And actually, with trustees being volunteers, sort of protecting that public benefit, like Andrew mentioned, the tax benefit that sort of charities have, is quite nice. But I do think there is an aspect of the role that makes it difficult and isn't accessible, and certainly doesn't lend itself to diversity, with the role being voluntary. And I think that's a certain aspect which the charity sector has been dealing with for a long period of time. Does that mean, though, that we should get away from trustees and we go to a paid trustee aspect, or in our more social enterprise models where the directors are being paid for the work that they do? It's a very hard question to answer. And I help a in fact, I saw somebody on Friday who's sort of starting off an organization, sort of does really good work with women from disadvantaged backgrounds, bring them together around employment rights, but also around how do they really get sort of their voice out there, and how do we really make sure that they are creating their own sort of businesses and developments. And when we were going through sort of charitable setup and sort of talking through the different options in terms of governance, immediately went to the social enterprise, because actually what they wanted was the leadership and the control and the aspect to be able to say how they want their organization to develop. And I think that's such a powerful tool that we have within startups and sort of social enterprise spaces. And I think we're quite in a lucky position, actually, that there's a lot of choice in terms of governance models out there for people, and that's quite flexible. I think for a lot of people as well, the charitable model does open up funding there, particularly with people who are quite traditional. Are you a charity? What's your charity number? The confidence that brings to be that charity number gives that trust and element that, yes, that my money is going towards a charitable organization. Charitable Commission have done all the checks, even though they might not have done all the checks, but they've done the checks effectively to a point where they're a registered charity, and I feel able to give my pound to that organization. Where for a community interest company, a social enterprise, the unincorporated association, are you giving that guarantee? Probably not. So it's really left to the organization to make that decision. So should the trustees probably be paid? Absolutely. But in reality, where does that money come from? Where does the money come from to be able to do that role? And does that create conflicts of interests, or does it sort of make sort of more accessible spaces? So I personally think the real sort of question here, particularly around sort of trustees and payment, is making sure that trustees have got a really good policy for expenses, that you cover expenses beyond lunch and travel, but around childcare sort of commitments, particular incentivizing why trusteeship is important, why trusteeship is a goal and can help in career progression, but also allowing people to not necessarily be a trustee if they want to get involved, allow them to own that space and create that time that they need to volunteer in most spaces. So if they don't have the time, they can at least get involved in certain aspects, and possibly not as a trustee. So yeah.
Daisy has just shared in the chat as well. We had I think this is actually where this idea of this panel came from. Last year, there was a question about should trustees be paid. So if you're interested in that particular issue, you can see me freezing constantly on that panel because I had really bad Wi-Fi last year. I guess there's one of the questions again around this whole idea of the voluntary board, though, as well, is about the accountability structures, because the Charity Commission only get involved in the most serious cases, generally the ones that are going to hit the media. So there's one question about voluntary and being paid. There's another question about, if you're a CEO and you've got a dodgy board, there's very little you can do to raise that with the Charity Commission. They don't want to know about it. They see that as an employment issue. So Andrew, I think you were going to say something before about the voluntary trustee role, but just wanted to kind of throw that accountability question in, because there are a lot of badly behaved boards out there. So, is that part
exactly. of the I was also thinking horses for courses, because you do have some of these massive charities delivering government services, under contract, which are, multi-million pound businesses that really you expect some voluntary trustees to turn up once a quarter and really have a grip on exactly what's going on. I think there's thoughts out there that suggest that, actually in those sorts of situations, the senior management team should be the trustees, or should be on the board with some non-executive directors who can hold them to account with different criteria. Or, you still in companies have members who appoint the trustees, and ultimately those members or the trustees are accountable to those members. That model's diminishing as time goes on because it's more complex to manage, so the accountability goes down. But I do think Alex is right, you can't just say all trustees can be paid, because your donations would disappear and they'd never get to the end user, as it were. But I think there's a size and purpose thing within this whole big picture called charity, As Felicia, you mentioned, it's multi-sector, multi-structure, all sorts of different things that get bundled into this charity word. They're also very, very different. I think you need to not rip it all up, but I think you can break it down to say, once you're over £1 million, you have a different accountability structure to small charities. Ignoring all the underlying legal requirements for being a CIO or a trust or an unincorporated association. You've got to apply the regulation proportionately. We haven't yet mentioned the Charity Commission. I might be mentioning them at some point later. But it is the one size fits all model is just doesn't work. I think the current model does work in particular areas. If you were thinking about your local village hall, and I'm sure you've also had the debates about big national charities against small local charities, impact, local engagement, local accountability. If you are the local village hall, you're accountable to your community, and you'll hear quite quickly if the roof not being kept on, or the local community is not happy with what those trustees are doing. So you're quite close to your community there. So accountability is closer to what the trustees are doing. If you are a national charity providing multiple services and you don't have any separate members, you're accountable to your donors, you're accountable to the government that's paying you under contract. But whether you are fit for purpose as an unpaid trustee board turning up once a quarter to really manage that and make sure things are going properly, I agree. I think there needs to be something else in there to help. Can I just add one or two, just to pick up a couple of things? Because Anu also mentioned mutual aid. Most sort of co-ops are specifically excluded from charity because the definition of charity is exclusively charitable purposes, which are set out in the Charities Act now, for the public benefit, and any private benefit, i.e. mutual benefit, must be only necessary and ancillary or incidental to the public benefit. So you have a conflict there where almost all the things we were talking about pandemic were automatically excluded from charitable status because we were looking after ourselves. And Alex also just wanted to touch on social enterprise as well. I see that as a model where it is doing exactly what we want it to do, but it doesn't get any of the tax benefits. And that seems inconsistent to me. So it comes back to where I sort of started. This is a tax thing, and I think we really need to work out what benefits from tax and tax and VAT adds yet more complexity if you're providing educational services or health services. You've got a different VAT regime. So it's tax and VAT that is driving lots of this. People come to people like you, Alex, and people like me, and I go, well, what's your funding model? You're not getting donations. You're not going to get gift aid. Don't be a charity, for heaven's sake. Why would you take on all that mess just for the sake of being called a charity? Unless you're getting the tax benefits, don't do it.
I mean, I see a lot of people going to the charity world because of the funding rather than necessarily the tax. It's that funders have some quite, Alex was talking about that before. I also then see a lot of former founders and CEOs from the charity sector setting up CICs because they want to get away from that trustee model.
Also lazy, sorry, Felicia, there's also lazy thinking in that, because charities can fund charitable purposes delivered by a commercial enterprise.
Yes, but you still have to deal with the trustee board at the end of the day. And for a lot of CEOs, that's tricky. I think one of the things that's really important to call out in this room is that every single one of us in this panel have been paid by charities to do work. We are inside the charity sector one way or another. Oh, sorry, Ellie, have you not? Because you're a civil servant. Sorry, you've been a volunteer. I take that back. The point is that we haven't been excluded from the charity sector. One of the big issues I think that I always feel when I have any conversations about what's wrong with the sector is it's about this participation and accessibility and inclusiveness, and the fact that we're not engaging everybody who might be interested in it. And I had a conversation with Anu yesterday, actually, separately, talking about this kind of challenge and the fact that we need to do better as a sector, because right now we're having this conversation, but is it valid if the people who've been historically excluded are still not here? So I guess I kind of throw that back. How can we get the right people in the room, or, you know, have, I say the right people, the people who have been excluded, the people who should have a voice in this process of talking about what's wrong and how, you know, what it should be, you know, how do we make them welcome and encourage them to participate? So any thoughts on that?
I want to cycle back just a tiny bit, sorry. So listening to everybody speaking, we're very, very much colouring within the lines. Like, if you're talking about transformation or liberation, even if it's like a baby step towards something like that, if you work from the position of these are the constraints that we're working with, which I agree is like the logical, sensible thing to do, and most people, like, that's within their comfort zone. The question about why people are not included or why people are excluded, or on the point about volunteers on boards or not, things like people that have caring responsibilities, disabled people, migrants, specifically people in the asylum system, volunteering actively works against them. So it's not that they have a seat, but they're not welcome. It's that it's set up to exclude them. So bringing them in like actively harms them. So I see a lot. Now, you say we've all been included in the charity sector. I would maybe argue with that, in that I was to the benefit of organizations. And as soon as I disagreed with anything, it was never a good experience. So, and that's been, it's not the same organization, there's several different organizations. It's like everybody follows a script. And at some point you start to go, is it me, or is there something inherently wrong with how things are? So when we talk about exclusion, I see a lot, and there has been, especially in 2020, a lot of conversation around including people and diversifying your board, etc., etc. And I go, great, yes, that will help bring in some other perspectives, but all of the work that organizations need to do in order to be able to support them, none of that happens. You kind of go, actually bring people in, and when things go horribly wrong for them, as they were always set up to go wrong for them, then we'll deal with crisis, then we'll work with employment law, then we will work within the very strict box that we have brought them into. And of course, then they're going to have a horrible time and they're not going to want to come back. Also, the people, the like truly brilliant people who have been part of the sector are no longer part of the sector. Look at the people at, like, behind Charities. So I look at people like me, like, we have given everything and been harmed and harmed and harmed and harmed. So I don't think it's a question of including people. It's all of the things that are set up structurally against us, some of which is that the Charity Commission and whatever their like purview is, and it can be that's one end of the spectrum where it's like very crisis heavy. They're looking like at what is the law, what can we follow, to the interpersonal stuff, like, and everything in between both of those areas. Like, where is the capacity? And when I say capacity, I also mean resources, I mean time, I mean people's like physical ability to deal with conflict, of being able to say, hey, that was racist, for example, and not have the entire system shut down on you. Like, you can't just bring people in and expect that everything will be okay. Like, that's the answer to the question. So I personally never want to work for an institution ever again, because I've been harmed that many times that I don't see there being, like, literally my health is at risk if I go back into organizations. So I would say the things that need to happen, there's all of these different fronts. So systemically, you can look, rather than coloring within the lines, you can vision for the world that you want to exist and work towards that. Rather than saying, this is the vision of my charity, you might go, how do I want to feel in the world that I want to live in? And what is the organization's purpose to try and get us there? And often, while you do say what your vision is, you don't really see the steps that take us there. With the sector, don't just like pass the responsibility on to people to make you better and hold the labor. Also give them the power to make those decisions, to run with that, like compensate them. These are like really things that are within our power. And like personally, identify like your agency it's okay to draw boundaries. It's okay to be like, this isn't working for me anymore. Actually, I'm out. All of those things are okay. There's possibilities in all of those areas. I've gone off on one, but
no, I really appreciate that, Anu, and I really appreciate you sharing that experience, because I think it's really important, and it's something that, you're not an isolated case of that going on, and I think it's really valuable to have you here to be able to say that, because that's why the sector is broken. That is a major reason why the sector is broken, in my opinion. We've reached the period of time for the Q&A. Would anybody like to add some questions? Obviously, if you want to specifically ask someone, do put that into your question, but we can just keep talking if people don't want to ask any questions. Daisy, I didn't miss any, did I? Is there a no? Oh, somebody just left the room, asked to do a Q&A, and they've left the room. Okay, we have one from Penny, which I think is broadly, so when things go wrong, how much do you think this is about the inherent structure of charities, and how much is about poor practice? For example, recruitment practices which can lead us to serve alongside trustees who are friends or family, and therefore make it difficult to put the charity's interests first. If the structure is broadly okay, there are issues in how we implement it. What should we do to support trustees to get the implementation right? Would anyone like to field that question?
I don't mind. For me, it's about poor practice. I think, Anna, you mentioned around mutual aids to start off, and when we start a pandemic, I remember going into a team meeting, and for context, I work at a cooperative. I work at a workers cooperative, sort of member-led organisation, sort of social enterprise, and which helps charities, and we really embody that aspect of sort of working for the members, but also working for our objectives, as if we don't achieve the objectives, we don't achieve effectively what we want, but also about the members. And in that sort of space, we were thinking, oh, what's going to happen to services sort of around sort of COVID? And what I really found interesting was that, some charities are really going to step up. Some really good charities are going to really step up in this space. And they didn't, but some did. And then we were really helping the mutual aids. And it really was about the people in the organization that was the absolute crux of what happened. And it always comes down to the people. It's the people in the organizations and the practices that they have and the ethos and approach that they have, which really sets direction for the organizations and for the communities that were around it. If we found that the people were motivated, were really sort of keen to get involved, to really support the communities, massive needs sort of in a particular area, there was really sort of an appetite to do so. However, if there weren't, some charities just went in their shell and just didn't do anything. And I think it's sort of really reflective, as I do think the charity sector is more open than sometimes public agencies and corporate bodies as such, for actually that reflection to happen. But I don't think all charities are there. I absolutely agree with that. And I do think that work in the charity sector doesn't lend itself to good sustainability. You think about how charities are structured and funded, what happens is you have your 3-year funding, your 6-year fund, or whatever it might be. It doesn't lean itself to really good employment practices, in terms of you're probably on bog standard pay, not really sort of good benefits. And that means you go to a public, la-di-da-di-da, and you go all over the place. So to me, it's about practice. It's that absolute practice which makes so much difference, because we can instigate really good procedures, ways of working into organizations that can be really beneficial for the people working in it, the volunteers and the communities that are helpful. But it needs to be the people that accept that change. And when they're accepting of that change, we see really good development. I set up a Romanian community group, and they have just absolutely flourished because of the absolute commitment they have for that work. And they're a community interest company, do wonderful piece of work, and it's the practice that we've been able to work with them to be able to build. That's been the key aspect. The structure, to be perfectly honest, like, there's very few charities nowadays that only fund registered charitable organizations. It's not really worth it if you're just looking for funding from registered or those looking for registered charities. The scope of what you are allowed to do and the scope of the broadness of service provision within social enterprise is broader, but the structure really doesn't matter. It could be a charity, it could be unincorporated, it could be whatever. The B Corps are ones now, aren't they? So it's all about the practice, all about practice.
I actually deliver trustee training, and one of the things I say in the trustee training is this is not really a system that's set up to work. So the only places where it works is where everybody is doing everything they can to make it work. So excellent communication and consideration and, you know, all the kind of different things, every possible piece of energy. And when they're not, well, I work in crisis and transition and I've got plenty of work. So, you know, it's there are plenty of problems out there. So Andrew, you were saying?
Well, it's also, the elephant in the room is it is subject to funding, and the trustees' anxieties for during the pandemic were what's going to happen to donations. Can I afford to do anything? I think some of the big grant funders did step up really well, and they went, okay, roll over. You can spend the money on whatever is important to you. You can do this, you can do that. Have next year's money now. We'll come back to you next year and see what's going on. But at the end of the day, those trustees are also responsible for the solvency of the charity. Especially if you're unincorporated, where you're potentially personally liable for meeting any of those debts, which is why we don't ever recommend being unincorporated, however small. But they do have those duties, and at some stage, the buck's got to stop with somewhere. We can't have everybody just spending money that they don't have. So I agree totally that we should be doing it better. It should be more bottom up than top down, and there are processes and procedures that can definitely be improved. But at the end of the day, there are these hard-edged legal restrictions that do impose obligations on people. And I think that's why some charities didn't step up that you would have expected to, because they just didn't have the resource to do it.
So I just want to say that, and just from a really basic concept, I think we need to be careful when we talk about practices that principally we're just talking about humans, right? We're asking humans to work within practices and processes, and we're asking humans to use the word accountability earlier. Like, we are asking them to be accountable for other humans working through these practices. And that means that these humans reflect all the flaws in our own societies. Like, we have a classist, racist society, and therefore there is inherently problems in those systems that we are asking people to challenge. And so I think we can't shy away from that, and that makes it really difficult to unpick, but also makes it why it's so important to unpick. That said, I will say that I think that's also why I'm such an advocate of thinking about why cross-sector pollination in this space is so important. Like, I work with lots of trustee boards who their trustee boards consist of other people who've worked in charities, and you're like, that's really valuable, and that's really that doesn't devalue what they bring, but there is other sectors who are challenging a different thought process. And so that's sort of bringing together that skills sharing and that experience sharing. You don't have to have worked in the charity sector to be a good trustee. And I think when we think about, what I'm saying is, if you were to read the charity sector in 2023, I think we would look to businesses to have more of a role than they do in funding the charity sector, for example. At the moment, it's all sort of scored up as corporate responsibility. I don't think that would be how 2023's charity would be created. And I think that's I just think we should unpick where that comes from a really basic human perspective.
We could probably do a whole panel on the issues around overheads restrictions, the lack of respect that you get from, there's the research from Stanford University that says that charities are warm but incompetent, corporates are cold but competent. And you see that attitude coming on the board a lot. And it's one of the big problems, because you're trying to bring in corporate skills, but actually what tends to come in is a real lack of respect for the charity sector. So those skills aren't translated because people won't go to training, they won't learn about the sector because they assume, hey, it's a voluntary sector. This isn't where people have real jobs, and it's it's something I see in literally hundreds of boards that I've worked with, and it's such a shame, because there are brilliant people in the charity sector and there's brilliant work being done. And I agree with you, Ellie, that we need to kind of use those skills. But right now there's a lot of assumptions and some, you know, quite derogatory attitudes towards the sector. And some of that comes from the structures and the restrictions we have, the attitudes around overheads, and, you know, you can't spend money on staff. You can't, I mean, I'm literally, today I had a funder say they'll only pay salary costs for 1 year. And you're like, well, then this is a 1-year program, because where do you expect me to get salary costs from next year? You know, this whole idea of, you know, frontline services. So we could probably have a whole panel on the restrictions that hold the charity sector back, and, you know, especially around money and that kind of thing. We've had quite a few questions. I know we're kind of running out of time, but Marcus a while ago said, any structure is always a partially flawed approximation of human behavior. Businesses have very similar problems with governance. Organizations have to be defined and delineated as part of any legal and tax definition. I think most of us are aware that there are challenges, but what are the solutions? For example, structure, internal and external, culture and context. Does anyone have any thoughts on that one before we're probably going to have to finish this Q&A fairly soon?
That's a big question, isn't it? Because
it, you know,
it starts right at the top, and it starts from the government having a look at what the sector is and what they're prepared to give tax credits for, and what they're prepared to fund, how they use the sector. And I think your point about respect, Felicia, is the government has no respect for the charity sector. Which
is why we don't really want them making those decisions, though, do we? Top down.
Yeah, well, they're driving the charity sector to do what they want, not what the charity sector thinks is best. In many cases, I mean, you know, there is a bit of co-production in more enlightened local authorities, but yeah, they're just, it's too big a topic. They haven't got enough time or brain space to look at it and go, what's a holistic way of approaching this people-centered part of our economy.
Any other thoughts on that one?
I would just say, I think if we think about sort of the charities sectors, and registered charities have been there for quite a while. Social enterprises are just forming in a lot of ways. They're very new to the world. So community interest companies, governance, legal setups, they are sort of changing how we operate and changing how we act as a sector. And I very much include them into that sector. So I do think there's solutions in there. And actually one of those solutions is the opening up of governance and the choice aspect that people have when starting organizations. So I do think those are, but I think you've just alluded to it in your question. It's like, I think all of it is the structure, the internal, external culture, but it needs to come with education, learning and outreach, that whole aspect around how we can effectively make sure that the communities are really educating us in the best ways that they would like to be served. I think ultimately that's what I would like for them to do. And that's how really our job is really around facilitating that and how we make that possible and how we make sure that people can hear that. I mean, also, I always say to any charity that I ever set up is your job is to close down as soon as possible, because that's what you should be doing. That really is what you should be doing. But it's harder. It's a hard graft to do that. So, but yeah, I do think that some progress has been made. I don't think we should say that everything's negative. I think that actually there has been some progress that has been made.
Great. So we're reaching kind of towards the end. I'm going to ask each of you to do one last takeaway. So if you want anyone watching this to take one key point away, you might have said it already, or you might not have said it, but you've had it burning inside of you. I'm going to go backwards from where we were before when I went from the beginning. So Andrew, can you start with your takeaway, please?
I think you have to face the fact we are where we are with legal structures and tax structures. They'll be tinkered with at the edges, just as we have with the most recent Charities Act. It's a little tinker here, a little tinker there. I think, Alex, I'm with you that there are models outside the charity sector that have more freedom to deliver what people need because they're not constrained by the charity model and all that goes with that.
Great. Ellie.
Yeah, I think the big two things would be around the evolution of charities needing to shift to reflect society, but I also think there's a real need for the charity sector to reconfigure and really ask themselves what they want from trustees and volunteers. and really invest in the future of that leadership and what the future of charity leadership looks like. And when I say future, I don't mean future, I mean like tomorrow, because I think that is another big gap that at the moment is not being addressed. So I think you talked about solutions, and like that is it. Like, we have access to spaces, and the charity sector is indicative of where society's energy is being willing to be invested. And I don't think that the sector it collectively is collaborating to drive that.
Right. Alex?
I think for me, it would be for everybody on this call to really advocate and provide, as whether it might be charity, mutual aid, or any social grouping or aspect, as an option to careers, as an option to either volunteering, however they see engagement. Because I think we see a lot about business and we see a lot about for-profit enterprise, but we don't really, the volunteering community sector, third sector, whatever you want to call it, is never in the picture when it comes to development of practice, development of our communities. And that's for me, is just spreading a word about the great things that are happening at a community level. And that is it really for me. Whatever charitable setup or social enterprise setup, just do some great work. That's all I think.
Thanks. And Anu?
Gosh, I'm gonna do a shout out to my mum. She'll watch this on YouTube later and be like, look, my class is stuff.
Hi, Anu's mum.
Also, this is a new hairstyle, and so she'll be like, what on earth have you done? But I bring her up because when we were kids, she said something to me that has stuck with me. It probably shouldn't have made sense when I was a kid, but it did. She said, freedom, and I said this to you in our call yesterday, Felicia. Freedom is like a cow tethered to a pole. The difference is how long the rope is. So I say that to say we are constrained by fear. We don't see the options available to us when we work from a place of fear. And that is just literally basically how humans function. So I would challenge everybody on this call to go back to your organizations with an explicit permission to dream. Like, if you could create not the organization of your dreams, but like the world of your dreams. And if that's too big, I'd challenge you to take a moment and think about how you'd like to feel in that world, and then work backwards to figure out and what is possible within my lifetime, of the structures that exist, of the possibilities that exist, and find the people on the fringes, because they're pushing forth into a reality that feels so far removed from us, but they exist. I'm going to give you one suggestion of an organization to look into. They're called Rad HR, and they've got policies and procedures and all of that, which is being creative within the bounds. And that's a really, really practical thing that is within your power to look into.
Great, thank you. I'd just like to, before we pass back to Daisy, I'm just going to draw attention to the fact there has been a number of comments of a couple of questions I didn't get to in the Q&A, the chat. So thank you very much for those who made them. But there are some good points made in the chat too. So do have a look at that if you haven't looked at that yet. Daisy, I think it's now back over to you for the wind up.
Thank you very much. I always feel conflicted whenever I'm kind of acting as compere, because I just love the chat so much. I want to get involved in the whole topic. So thank you so much for such a brilliant hour. It's absolutely whizzed by, and lots of food for thought as we head into the evening. Just wanted to share a couple of things. So this is one session of a huge program in which you can get so many more of these panel discussions. So I'll post a link to our Eventbrite page where you can see all of our upcoming sessions as part of the Trustee Learning Programme. We've also just launched our Festival of Trusteeship, so it's Trustees Week from the 6th to the 10th of November, and we've got 20 online events throughout that week. Many are free, and the maximum you'll pay for each event is £5 with a weekly pass of £20. So hopefully really good value way of stopping to think about lots of these issues. Our website is full of resources. You've got lots of free guides on there, and to help you stop and think about whether you're being the best that you can be, and whether your board is as well if you are a trustee as well. So I'll post those links into the chat. and also we'll include them in the email with the recording as well. Very lastly, you've just got a very short evaluation form. We'd love to know whether we're being helpful to you. So please, if you could take a moment to fill that in. But with all of that being said, I will leave you to enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope to see you at a future session sometime soon. Thank you very much and take care.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.